we're trying to construct systems in which we can live together well. And this would include religious instructions, philosophical doctrines, the law, social institutions, practices, norms, habits. All of these things should be part of this massive, complex moral infrastructure that we are developing and repairing and updating and sometimes tearing down to help us to live well together. And that's something I'm very sympathetic to. I think that's a very good way of thinking about how our world is being constructed, partly because it motivates us to do the work to maintain this infrastructure and try to repair and expand it.
What is a healthy kind of tearing down? You just mentioned that for the first time.
Well, it's a feature of our imperfect history that a lot of the infrastructure that we put in place actually does very, very bad things. So, for example, many of our laws were designed in times when our societies were much more racist and misogynistic than they are today, and they're still very misogynistic and racist. So, in those cases, those structures actually do bad things, and they should be dismantled. For example, in many human societies, there are very oppressive expectations about how women ought to conduct themselves, how they ought to live, the sorts of interests that they ought to have. And these typically disadvantage women in all sorts of terrible ways. Those things should be dismantled because even if they were once introduced for good purposes, which is questionable, right now we recognize they're doing bad things. So that bit of the infrastructure, that needs to come down and it needs to be either replaced or redeveloped into something progressive.
And it seems like there's different ways to have that piece come down, right? It's almost like that's what the law should be best suited towards. Like if you have developed a law that can be rewritten and easily rewritten, and you don't have too terrible of corruptions within your legislative system, then you should be able to adjust those issues without sort of burning the place to the ground.
Because I
Well,
think, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, I think that there is an ideal, I suppose, in most legal systems where they have mechanisms for the updating and revising the laws and enacting them properly. But in practice, things are much messier than that.
What do you mean?
Like Civil War, slavery, ending of slavery in the United States, perhaps. Or...
Like it's just much more difficult to do that than some noble thing that happens at the judicial bench where people in robes make really good decisions and everything's okay on the far side.
Yes, I think there are limitations within systems of laws themselves. For example, they usually contain ambiguities and they have to be interpreted. Therefore, much depends upon who's interpreting them. Much will depend, for example, on who the judge is in the case. And in other cases, even when the laws are in place and they're well defined, they don't always get equally enforced. So, for example, in many human societies, if you have enough power or money or authority, you exist in a state where the laws don't really apply to you. You can use your power to avoid punishment and censure.
Interesting. And do you think that that is secretly what individual humans aspire towards? Being in
To a
that
state
position.
of
What was that?
to a state of power, kind of powerful invulnerability.
Yeah, exactly.
Light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, I can imagine that many human beings, if they're honest, feel the temptations, because I think one of the things that drives our vices is a sort of egoism. Because even when people recognize the importance of moral and social rules and norms, they will still sometimes chafe against them and feel themselves to be constrained. And in those cases, I think people will feel a temptation to have that power to just ignore or set aside those rules when it suits them. Now, that's one thing that I think many people struggle against, because at the same time, people recognize that those moral rules and norms have important roles and functions, but they're still experienced as constraints or as limits that sometimes we will resent. And that's why an important part of being a moral person is being very honest about your attitudes and your psychology, rather than pretending that you're some perfectly noble creature. Very few of us are one of those.
Transparency is not particularly popular among humans, it seems like.
It's extremely difficult to get people to be extremely honest and transparent about who they are, especially to themselves. Partly because if you have any serious moral sensibility, you'll recognize that there are aspects of your belief, your conduct, your past life, your present life, that you would be morally critical of. everybody has vices and failings. Everybody will have done bad things. They might be minor, they might be major. Everybody knows that they have bad habits. And that's why it's very, very difficult to be transparent, to look within yourself and be honest and open about your failings. It's very, very difficult to do that.
And to still keep loving yourself enough to take care of who you are in the future, I imagine.
There can be a sort of a self-regard of that sort of self-love sort, I suppose, yes, where you recognize that the only way that you will fundamentally get better as a person is to be honest, in which case honesty and self-love and self-interest come together quite nicely. But still, there's a real pain to being honest about your failings in that way. At least in my experience, I find it easier to be honest about my own failings and moral limitations in the company of extremely close friends, because it's easier to surrender your vulnerabilities in context of trust. And there are a few people in the world I do trust enough with my vulnerabilities in that sense, and they help me to get better.
I can't wait to get to Earth and make some friends.
We'll make it eventually. Do you have anything to ask us about alpha floss?
Well, I'm wondering if there are misanthropes on your planet, or whether there could even be misanthropes, or whether you are actually the morally wonderful creatures that we've been waiting for.
There used to be a lot more misanthropes. So, back before we moved out, we had to move alpha floss at some point. Our sun was going out. And so it was this whole difficult thing, 500 years in the darkness, we found another sun. But when we came back, we had to really recreate the entire biome on the surface. And we had to be incredibly careful about the ways and the patterns that we brought back. And
it was so much work that every single bacterium was sort of appreciated.
And there's been less misanthropy since then because, or Miss Alva Flossie since then, because we've just been focused on these questions of how the whole fits together and that we have a distinct need to take care of that whole. And it seems like humans, if you started to be more caretakers of the earth rather than just inhabitants of the earth, that might address some of the misanthropy problems.
On Alpha Floss, even our physics, every single piece of our understanding comes down to an interconnected understanding. So we don't see the trees as necessarily distinct from ourselves. In fact, we wouldn't be able to breathe without them, so we couldn't exist without them. So we don't really see ourselves as existing separately. It's really taken a long time.
That's very interesting. So it was an emergency. It was a genuine global crisis that made you all collectively realize the need to really kind of move up a few gears in moral terms.
But it was a real end of the planet crisis. And it was an opportunity for us to consider the fact that without us, the planet would have died. And humans seem like they're coming to that point as well because you're starting to move off the planet. And if you move off the planet and you actually create an effective backup hard drive, so to speak, where you have animals on Mars or animals on different planets, seed stocks, then you actually become stewards of the planet in a way that you never have been before. The only interplanetary species ensuring that life continues.
That's interesting because when human beings are debating space travel between planets within our solar system, because our technology is not so good yet, one of the arguments people give for not going to other planets and colonizing them is that until we can live properly on this planet and take care of this one, we shouldn't really be going to any other planets. And it's interesting, the idea that actually moving outwards into the stars in that sense could actually drive people to transform themselves as a whole. So that was, I suppose, part of the vision of Star Trek. So in that television series, it was actually meeting an extraterrestrial race called the Vulcans, which really provoked human beings to come together. The awareness that we are not alone in the world. And if we're going to take our place on the intergalactic stage, we really need to be stage ready, morally speaking.
Exactly. Yeah. So I hope that you fare better than you have in the past, Dr. Kidd, in terms of these human problems.
I genuinely do hope that we get better over time. I think that I think if people are going to get better, they need misanthropy, because without a proper diagnosis of the nature and extent of a problem, you're never going to be able to overcome it. And one thing that's guaranteed to make for a bad future is dogmatic optimism. Things won't get better just because. They'll only get better if we are honest, disciplined, and give a true account of our current moral situation. And if the misanthrope is right, we've got a lot of work to do. But the misanthrope of my sort, anyway, does want people to do the work. It's not a counsel of despair. It's saying we need to be honest about what we're like if we're going to become better as time goes on.